Receptors, you'll notice we kind of skipped some lectures. We kind of jumped around a bit. 13 and 15 we'll come back to. We're on 16. 16 is going to deal with eyes and ears, okay, as well as other receptors. We're going to start with kind of the low-end receptors, and we'll move up in complexity, going to taste and smell, and then eventually getting to sight. Okay? Hearing, I guess, balance and sight. Okay? Sound good? So first we're going to talk about receptors. Okay? And so we've talked about how, kind of, at least rudimentarily, how the brain works, okay, how things go out. Okay, but what we haven't talked about is really the stimulus and how we monitor a stimulus. Okay? We said it does happen, and we said it comes into the brain, but now we're going to talk about the actual organs that do it. Okay? So we're going to start by talking just about somatosensory organs. Okay? And those can be as simple as receptors that are just free nerve endings. Okay? Free nerve endings, basically dendrites. Okay? Go to certain parts, and manipulation of the membrane causes channels to open, okay, resulting in receptor potentials, which is just a gradient potential. Okay? Does everybody get that idea? But they can be more complex too. They can actually be organs. Okay? They can be organs too. Okay? Someone in Kentucky. What's the difference between what is an organ? Remember, it was two tissues together, right? Okay, so if we have a receptor, it's a nervous tissue. Okay, we add to it, say, some connective tissue wrapped around it. Now we all of a sudden have a sensory organ. Okay? Most of the time we don't include those in the same level of organ as, let's say, a stomach or something like that, but it is truly an organ. Does that make sense? Okay. We're going to see a couple of those, not a huge amount, but they vary in their complexity. Okay? So, what does sensory receptor, whether it be an organ or just a receptor in and of itself, okay, it takes some sort of stimulus energy, okay, whether that be light or whether that be pressure, and it transduces it, it changes it, okay, into electrical energy, an action potential. Okay, eventually, a graded potential to start, and then an action potential eventually. Does that make sense? Okay, and so that's what the function of a receptor is, this type of sensory receptor. Okay, so 2 parts to any reception. Okay, first is the sensation. Okay, we have to take whatever that modulus is, okay, whatever that type of stimulus is, and we have to convert it to electrical energy. Okay, and that's the actual sensation. And then, to have that have any meaning, we have to get it to the brain and let the brain interpret it. Okay, and that's the perception part. Okay? Do you get the difference? Okay, it turns out not all sensations will go to the brain eventually. Okay? That helps us to get rid of, let's say, low quality or low level stimuli. Okay, so that we're not bothered by everything. Okay, does that make sense? And that can be at, the receptor doesn't get enough to create an action potential in the nerve, or maybe we have spinal gating which blocks it later so that it doesn't get to the brain. Okay, it can be a lot of different things. But for it to be understood, it it must get to the brain. Okay? We could even have a reflex that doesn't get to the brain. Okay? That's a sensation, some sort of stimulus, that feeds to spinal cord, or maybe a little higher level, and you get a patterned response from that that doesn't need the brain to activate. Okay? So did I get that idea? But for perception, we need the brain. Okay? So, what do we get from a receptor? Okay, well, we know what type of receptor it is. So we get a modality. All that is a fancy name for what type of stimulus it is. Okay? Now, all receptors, no matter what it is, all channels, respond to mechanical process. Okay, for example, what do the receptors in your eye respond to? Light, right? They're photoreceptors. Everybody knows that, right? You may not have known the term photoreceptor, but it makes sense, right? Okay, close your eyes, take your thumbs, stick them in your eyes, and push. Not horribly hard. You're starting to see the kaleidoscope? I know. First class, no one did it either. Okay? You've done it at one point. You start to see this kaleidoscope of lights, right? Okay? That's still the photoreceptors going off. It's just you've now activated the photoreceptors. Instead of activating them with light, you've activated them with mechanical pressure. Okay? All receptors respond to mechanical. Okay? I should say all channels respond to mechanical. Okay, it may bypass the receptor completely. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, but they also have a specialized modality that they respond to. In some cases, it's still mechanical. Okay? Where the stimulus is, you can think of this as a labeled line hypothesis. What this means is your brain knows where and what the stimulus is. Okay, why? Because you know the receptor in your finger, okay, is mapped to that on your somatosensory cortex. Okay? So if that part of the brain goes off, that means it was something in the finger. Okay? Pretty simple. Okay, each neuron has a receptive field. You should all know this because you played with the receptive field when you did two-touch discrimination. What that means is when you got it close enough, you got it to a point where one receptor was seeing both points. And if one receptor is seeing both points, it can only tell it once. Okay? So you can't send a signal that says, oh, this is point A and this is point B for the same receptor. Okay, it only knows one. It can only go on once. Does that make sense? Whereas if it was over two receptor areas, then you could feel the difference. Okay? You get intensity. Okay, how do we know intensity? Well, there are a couple of things that go into this. One we've already talked about, okay? The number of action potentials generated, okay, and how close together they are will define a lot of intensity. Okay? But you also have how many receptors respond, okay, which kind of gives you not only an intensity, but how broad that is. Okay? And what type of receptors respond. In your eye, they're all the same receptor type. Okay? But on your skin, you have lots of different receptor types that respond with different intensities of stimulus. Okay? Some that are very, very, very sensitive, and some that aren't sensitive at all. If all of them are going off, that means it's an intense stimulus. If only the really sensitives are going off, that means it's not an intense stimulus. Does that make sense? Okay? Okay. Last part is the duration. Okay. How long does the stimulus last? Obviously, you can tell that by action potentials. How long do we continue to send action potentials, right? Well, it turns out it's not quite that simple. There are two different types of receptors. Okay? We have phasic receptors and tonic receptors. Phasic receptors respond initially, but then they adapt. And they kind of phase out. Okay? And so you lose the sensation. Okay? So, you ever walked into a room and it stinks? Yeah? Okay, did you notice that even though you stayed in the room, that the stink went away? Okay? I promise you the stink didn't go away. You just stopped noticing it. Okay, you stop your olfactory receptors adapting, and they're no longer sending. They are phasic receptors. They give you a big burst, but then they kind of die off. It's also the reason why the first bite is often the best bite of anything. The third or the fourth bite, and you don't really taste it as much. Okay? Especially since smell is intimately combined with taste. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Tonic receptors do not adapt, or if they do adapt, it's really, really, really slowly. Okay, so they're not going to phase out. These are important for things, especially things like proprioception, understanding position of body. Okay, we do want to know at all times what position everything is in. Okay, that is told to us by receptors that are found in the tendons, receptors that are found in the muscles, receptors that are even found in the joint capsules. Okay, and they will relay what is the tension of this muscle, what is the actual position of it. Okay, if you know the tension of the muscles, you know the position of the joint, you know the position of your head, which we'll get to later next lecture. Okay, if you know the position of your head, you know the position of your muscles, you know the position of your body. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so we can classify receptors on what their stimulus is. This is a very short, non-exhaustive list of stimuli and the type of receptor. Okay, I'm going to say the receptor type. You tell me what the stimulus is. If you don't know by the word, that's okay. It's out to the right. Okay, thermoreceptor. What is it?
Temperature.
Temperature. Yes and no. Turns out it's delta temperature. Change in temperature. Okay? So it goes off more when there's a change in temperature. So, you've ever been out in the cold? Didn't have gloves? Played in the snow anyways? Hands got nice and cold? You went inside and decided to wash your hands. You put on cold water in the sink because you knew it was going to hurt. You put your hands in the cold water and it still felt like it was burning you. Okay? What happened? Well, thermoreceptors are phasic. So they went off while you were playing in the snow, but then they got adapted to the cold. And so now they're happy with the cold. Okay? You go inside, you put your hands are at 40 degrees. You put your hands in 65 degree water. Okay? And when you do that, that's a change of 25 degrees. Your thermoreceptors go, whoa! You're burning yourself, dummy! Because they only detect it's a change in temperature. Does that make sense? So your brain reads that as, ow, that hurts, even though it doesn't. Does that make sense? Okay? Okay. Photoreceptors. Light, yeah. Pretty easy. Nociceptors, a little harder, because most of us don't know what noci means. Okay, it's pain. Okay, these look for damage of tissue. Okay, really is what they're looking for. So, release of chemicals from damaged tissue, or even just straight chemicals. Okay? Pain is something we really need to know about, because it keeps us from doing stupid stuff. Okay? Chemoreceptors. Chemicals. So we're going to talk about taste. We're going to talk about smell. Those are all chemoreceptors. But there are also internal chemoreceptors that deal with things like pH. They deal with carbon dioxide levels, oxygen levels. Okay, so we have a bunch of different chemoreceptors. Okay? And then we have mechanoreceptors. And mechanoreceptors respond to mechanical movements slash changing of the shape of a membrane. Okay, deflection of a membrane. Okay, and like I said, all receptors are mechanical receptors to a certain amount. All channels are mechanical channels of a certain amount. Okay, so mechanoreceptors are much broader. Okay, but there are ones that are just involved in touch. Okay, they're just involved in pressure. Okay, what's the one pressure you think about in the body? Blood pressure, right? Okay, you have what are called baroreceptors, which are a type of mechanoreceptor that deal with pressure. Okay? Make sense? You can also classify them about where the stimulus is, if it's external, internal, or muscle. Okay? External receptors, they look at or monitor external stimuli, environmental stimuli. Okay? Enteroreceptors monitor internal stimuli. Okay, usually when we say enteroreceptors, we're talking about visceral receptors. Okay, ones on the organs that are internal. However, there's another whole group of enteroreceptors called proprioceptors, which, like we've talked before, deal with muscle and what is the contractile or tension on a muscle. Okay, or ligament or tendon. Okay? So here are some examples of receptors. You do not need to know these. That's not the reason I put them up. The reason I put them up is so you can kind of have an idea of how complex they can be. Okay? So, free nerve endings. Okay, you have a lot of dendrites that go out into the epidermis, okay, and other places, okay, like wrapped around hairs, okay, that respond to changes in that tissue. Okay? Makes sense? But then you can also have all of tactile discs, tactile corpuscles, inbulbs, bulbous corpuscles, and lamellar corpuscles, who all also respond to deflection of the epidermis. But each one has a different intensity that it responds to, which gives us a gradation in intensity values. That makes sense? Okay. Then, also on here are the muscle ones. Usually they're free nerve endings over top of something, and they'll have like a modified muscle cell that is actually a monitor rather than a contractile. Okay? And they wrap around it, and that tells you what's the tension on it. Okay? These are, like I said before, tonic, which means that they continuously, the more tension, the more signals they're sending to the brain. The less tension, the less signals. Okay, so your brain knows what's the position, what's the contractile state of each muscle at all times. Okay? Okay, pain. Pain is bad. Right? Okay. Pain is good. Okay? Pain is good because it tells you you're doing things that are bad. Okay? Without pain, you don't live long. There are people who are born without pain reception. Okay? They usually don't live past single digits. Why? Because they do something, or lots of somethings, very stupid. And they don't learn from it because it doesn't hurt. Does that make sense? Pain is the great way of teaching you no. Okay? That makes sense? Okay, so it's protective, it keeps you from doing things. There are diseases where pain is kind of mitigated and you don't have it. Leprosy is probably, first off, leprosy for the most part is totally gone now. The reason is it's really easily treated with antibiotics, okay? So it's really easy. But back in the 1700s or earlier when we didn't have antibiotics, you can go back way back, they'd have leprosy colonies, okay? Why? They had no idea what to do with the leprosy. They just knew that they didn't want to play with it. So they'd take the people who had leprosy and put them in a colony and keep them separate from the rest of the population. They'd isolate them, okay? Worked really well, okay? The problem was these people lose feeling of pain, and so they would lose limbs, and they wouldn't feel it, okay? Which I guess if you're going to lose a limb, that's probably a better way to lose it and not feel it, but you know, not necessarily good because you would feel the initial infection and the infection part, but you don't, it damages the nerves so that you don't feel the rest, okay? Same thing happens with diabetes, okay? Much slower, not fast, but that's why you start to get problems with diabetes, with sores on the feet and things like that, where they don't notice, they don't know, they don't heal really well, so they end up having to have feet amputated, okay? Not what you really want, okay? Types of pain, okay? There's pain that comes from nociceptors. Okay, that pain is usually tissue injury, and then there's neuropathic pain. Okay, this comes from either damage or let's just say nerves that are hyperactive. For example, we're going to talk a little bit about referred pain. Okay, referred pain is the pain that you get. Usually it's an internal pain where it's not specific in its placement. So you've heard if you have a heart attack, you tend to get pain in your left arm. For some reason, girls tend to get it in the right arm. You won't ever know, but anyways. In your left arm, well, why would you get pain in your left arm from a heart attack? Well, it comes down to a couple of things. There's probably shared pathways. There's the fact that most of that pain comes through what are called slow pathways, which are unmyelinated pathways. And now if we're unmyelinated, we don't have that insulation. So one nerve axon may affect another nerve axon. Okay? So it bleeds over and then you see the effect of another axon, which means you have axons that are incorrectly signaling pain. Does that make sense? Okay? There's also phantom pain. Okay? You guys heard of phantom pain? Okay, so I'm going to give you my best guess to what phantom pain is. Okay? So, my sister is polydactyly. You guys know what polydactyly means? She had 6 fingers on each hand, and 6 toes on each foot when she was born. Okay? She is odd, I mean, other than that. She is odd even when we talk about polydactyly because her fingers and toes were fully functional. Because usually they are not fully functional. Okay? But she had little tiny pinkies on the outside and little tiny pinky toes on the outside. Okay? When she was 1 year old, they did surgery to remove the extra fingers and toes. Okay? Why? Kids can be mean. You don't want to be a freak. Okay? And there's not much more freak than 6 fingers. Okay? So, my parents had her fingers and toes removed. Okay? Does that make sense? Well, still to this day, if she goes past something or gets a scar, okay, when she's not really paying attention, she gets pain in her finger or her toe, even though it's not there. Okay, this is similar but much less of a version as people who lose a limb and then can feel it afterwards. Okay, so what's happening? Okay, 2 things. One is your body, your brain doesn't understand surgery. Okay, it has a body picture that is there from whenever you developed the map. Okay? Just because you cut something off doesn't mean the brain goes, oh, good. I don't got that. I don't have to use that part anymore. We'll get rid of it. It still has the map. Okay? And so, if you do something that your body subconsciously knows should hurt you, such as going past an object and going like this without touching it, but just going there, and you know subconsciously, because you're not paying attention, that you should have hit your pinky, you know, that extra one, okay, you feel the pain of it. Because your brain goes, oh, that should have hurt. Make sense? Add on to that, when they took out the pinky, or whoever's leg, okay, they didn't take out the nerves. There's still axons there. Okay? So when they touch that, those axons will still generate action potentials. And your brain assumes that's from the pinky, not from the scar. Does that make sense? And so you're still left with an image, a body image, that includes whatever that extra part is. Does that make sense? All that meant for me growing up was when my sister and I fought, she would bite and I would try to flick her scars. You do what you can. Okay? Does that make sense? Everybody get that? Oh, oops, did I go too? Yeah, okay, 2 different types of pain, fast pain and slow pain. Okay, this is tissue injury pain. Okay, fast pain goes on fast, myelinated axons, big axons, so it goes nice and fast, gets to the brain quickly. Okay, it is usually a sharp pain. Okay, something that, it may still last a while, don't get me wrong, but it's a sharp pain. It's very, you can point to where the pain was. Okay? And then there's slow pain. Okay, slow pain goes on unmyelinated axons, so it's really, really slow. It takes a long time to get to your brain. Okay, it tends to be less localized. For example, if you have a stomach ache, you call it a stomach ache, even though it may be your small intestines, it may be your stomach, it may be your large intestine, hell, it may be your gallbladder. You have no frickin' idea. Okay? You just know there's pain right? Okay? That's an example of slow pain, okay? It tends to be a dull, aching pain, maybe even a burning pain, okay? So there's your map for referred pain. Okay, some of them are interesting, like liver and gallbladder. Well, it does affect the liver. It also affects your right shoulder. Okay, lung and diaphragm, your left shoulder. Okay, kidneys all the way down into your legs. Your urinary bladder, your butt. Okay, so these are ones that are often seen in pains in those places. Okay? Okay, so we do have the ability to block pain. Okay, we do this with what are called endogenous opioids. Okay, they are endorphins, enkephalins, and dynorphins, which are just modulators. Okay, we can basically stop pain signals as they're going up the spinal cord. Kind of nice. Okay, so it's called spinal gating. Okay, and it inhibits the second order pain neuron. Means it's not the receptor. It's not the receptor and the neuron going to the spinal cord, but it's the one coming from that and going up. Okay. You have two ways of activating this. There is a part from your brainstem handled by, I don't want to say the mesencephalon off the top of my head. But anyways, it sends down signals to block pain. Okay, and these are called descending analgesic fibers. And then there's the way at the injury itself. It turns out mechanoreceptors can activate the same mechanism. Okay, and basically that means if you're hurt, you can rub it. Okay, and it can start. I'm not going to get all of it, but it can lessen the pain. Okay, does that make sense?
Is this why little kids, like when they smack their head off or something, will start scratching it? They do that at daycare. I don't know. I teach 4
Scratching it? You mean like this?
Yeah.
Or
like,
doing this? Okay, on to taste. Okay, so can anybody feel their taste buds on their tongue? Feel
whenever I burn my tongue.
it? Sort of. Yeah. So what you're not feeling taste buds, you're feeling papillae. Okay? Papillae are a structure that have taste buds in them. Okay? And the structure is different depending on where it is, and even the papillae are different depending on where they are. Okay? At the front of your tongue, you have what are called fungiform papillae. They have actually no taste buds in them. Okay? They are more for feeling texture. This is why every small child stuffs things in their mouth. Okay? Why? Because texture tells you a lot of information. Okay? And you get a huge amount of information from just that touching. Okay? So your tongue is a great wealth of information. We learn not to do that because it's probably not the best practice to stick everything in their mouth. Right? But children are just gaining information from it, so you can't really blame them. It's a good mechanism of doing it. I would not suggest you go around licking things, though. Okay? Behind those, okay, we have the folate. Okay? These are found on the sides and the middle of the intermediate part of your tongue. Okay, and then on towards the back, we have the valet. Okay, and they're kind of similar structures with an extra wall. Okay, so this would be a folate. Okay, it has bumps and then it has these crevices. Okay, and these little bulbs of cells that you see on the sides. Okay. Umami. Umami is a Japanese word for beef products. Okay, I think it means beef broth specifically. I don't actually know. Okay, but umami deals with the amino acid glutamate and aspartate. Okay, and I'm assuming that's what you meant by savory. Yeah. Okay. It deals with glutamate and aspartate, which are in high amounts in meat products. They're just a common amino acid. Okay, probably the one you've heard about. Okay, if you look at Asian cuisine, you'll find that they add a spice that Europeans never thought of, and that's monosodium glutamate, MSG. Okay, having gone to Japan this summer, okay, they don't enjoy beef the same way we do. Okay, when we eat beef, we eat a steak, right? Okay, they don't give you steaks. They give you really thin slices of the beef. It's fantastic beef. It's Wagyu beef. It's fantastically fatty. Okay, but it's a really small slice. So they didn't have enough, let's say, territory to grow cows. Not to mention cows took a lot of effort. Okay, so they developed using MSG as a spice, which gives you the same taste sensation without having all the meat. Okay, kind of cool. It's very good, but it is very not a lot. Okay? So if you're used to steak, when you go somewhere and you get like 16-ounce porterhouse, that's not what happens in Japan. Okay? But anyway, so that's beef broth. Okay? Sour is hydrogen, it's pH. Okay? It is acidic. Okay, probably the most common for us are acetic, citric, or ascorbic acids. Okay? Do you recognize all those? Acetic, citric, and ascorbic acid. Okay. I won't tell you what they are. Okay? And then bitter. Bitter is alkaline things. Okay? High pH. Okay? Bitter was probably developed because most poisons are bitter. In fact, how many of you like to go to a nice restaurant and get a salad? Do you like the field greens? You know, the ones that kind of look like weeds? That's what they are, by the way. They're like dandelion weeds and things like that. It's okay. Okay, they're a little bit more expensive version of a salad. Okay, they are bitter, much more bitter than romaine or definitely an iceberg. Okay, you tend to like bitter things. It's okay. It doesn't hurt you until you eat the wrong bitter thing. Okay, my mother likes the whites of oranges. Yeah, talk about bitter. It's about as bitter as it gets in mine. Pretty nasty, I think. But yeah, she'll eat the peel. But anyways, okay? So bitter is to keep you away from things that are poisonous for the most part. Though some people like bitter. It's okay. Then we have, like I said, water and fat. Okay, fat is called oleogustus. Okay, which literally means fat taste. Okay? Okay, so now let's talk about smell. Okay, smell is really closely linked with taste. Okay, about 80 to 90% of your taste is smell. You'll notice that when you taste something, you taste a lot more than 6 sensations. Okay, it's much more complex than that. Okay, that's because smell deals with the rest of them. Okay, and we can differentiate between about 2,000 and 4,000 different odors. Someone who is very, very sensitive can differentiate to about 10,000 different odors. Okay, a dog can differentiate 50 to 100,000 different odors. Okay, so much better smell than we have. Okay, we do this with what seems to be about 400 different receptors, and yet we can differentiate up to 10,000 different odors. Makes sense? Well, turns out different combinations of different receptors is thought to give us different sensations. Okay? By the way, there are jobs for those people who can do 10,000 odors. There are jobs you would never think of, like people who develop the flavorings for Frito-Lay. You ever wonder how someone came up with cheeseburger Doritos? Which are fantastic, by the way. They really do taste like a cheeseburger. I love them. Okay? But they actually are employed by places like that to do tasting. Okay? Anyways, so we have an olfactory bulb. Okay, it sits down on the cribriform plate of the ethmoid. Remember that? Okay, and the receptors reach down through those little holes in it and into the ceiling of the nasal cavity. Make sense? It works the same way as taste. Did you ever notice when your mouth is dry you can't taste? Well, same thing goes when your nose is dry. You can't smell. Okay? You have experienced it most likely if you've ever had an antihistamine and it dried out your nose very nicely and you couldn't really smell anything for a while. Okay, why? Because you need that nice snot layer to dissolve the chemicals in so that these guys, which have the same cilia, okay, can recognize the odorant. Does that make sense? Okay? And so what it looks like is we have a nice snot layer, we have supporting cells, and then we have our actual receptors. The receptors go up to what are called glomeruli. Glomeruli are little balls where the receptors interact with the neurons that are going to go to the brain. Okay? And it's thought that these different glomeruli, combinations of them, is what results in the different smells. Okay? But that snot layer is required for dissolving of the things. If you don't have a snot layer, you won't get the odorant recognized. Okay? To this, in your nose, you have some adaptations. Okay? First off, you bring air in through a very small hole, your external nair, otherwise known as your nostril. Okay? When it comes in, it opens up into a big chamber. Not that big, but bigger than the hole, right? Okay? That expansion of the air leads to turbulence. Add to it, you have those nasal conchas. Remember those? Okay? As the air hits them, it causes the air to spin. Okay? Altogether, the whole point of that is, theoretically, most of the air should hit the ceiling, dissolve anything in it that is an odorant, or at least some of it, and therefore make it recognizable. Okay, does that make sense? When we get to the respiratory system, we'll talk about the other uses for that same technique. Okay? Damage these, and if you damage them badly enough, they don't come back. Okay? Probably the best example of this is cocaine use. Cocaine is sniffed into the nose, right? Okay? That leads to the burning of these receptors. That burning of the receptors go back. And so people who used a lot of cocaine don't have a sense of smell anymore. So there are a bunch of 80s executives that don't have smell anymore. Because that was all the rage in the 80s. Okay? Now we like opioids. Okay? So you have about 400 different types of receptors. However, you can still normal a person can get between 2,000 and 400,000 odors. Okay? Humans are capable of up to 10,000 odors. Dogs far outstrip us. Okay? They're far more capable than we are. I'm not sure my dog is. He's kind of stupid. At least his nose is stupid. You can throw things on the floor and you can't find it. Anyways. Okay? Okay, let's talk about sound. Okay, sound is a pressure wave. Okay? Sound waves are pressure waves. What does that mean? Movement, vibration of one atom in air is pushed to the next atom in the air, is pushed to the next atom in the air, okay? In so doing, you move the sound. That means sound must have some sort of medium to move through. If you're in a vacuum, sound does not move. This is why things like Star Wars are funny. Yeah, I like Star Wars, don't get me wrong. But when you see an explosion of a ship in space and people on that ship can hear it, it's just humorous. Because there's no air, so no sound can travel. You know that. Star Trek is better. Sorry. I like it both. But Star Trek actually pays attention to science. Star Wars doesn't. Okay? Anyways, so movement of air molecules hitting each other, pushing the sound on. Okay? It's why also that sound moves better through water than air, because lots more molecules to move through. Okay? Though your ear sucks for water, just in case you want to know. Two different things. Pitch. Okay, pitch is the frequency. Okay, the actual distance between the waves. Okay, loudness is the amplitude. Okay, we're going to talk about how we understand frequency a little bit later. Amplitude or loudness, we already know how we understand it. How do we understand it? Anyone? Bueller? No. None of you seen Ferris Bueller's Day. You should really watch that. It's well worth a watch. There's a famous scene, but he skips school. And there's okay? Okay, you hear between 20 and 20,000 hertz. Most voices are between about 104,000 hertz. Okay, so you hear best between about 104,000 hertz. Okay, does that make sense? Something that is low number of hertz is a low note. James Earl Jones' voice. Something that is more hertz is a high note. Mickey Mouse's voice. Does that make sense? Okay? Normal conversation is about at 60 decibels. You begin to feel pain when you get a bit over 100 decibels. Okay? Does that make sense? We're going to talk about the different structures in the ear and what's going to happen. For the most part, you amplify most sounds. However, you have the ability to dampen them also. Okay? It turns out you use the same structures to amplify and dampen. Okay? So here is the graph of what you hear, okay, and where you're looking. Speech, like I said, is somewhere between 100 and 4,000 or 5,000. Okay, music a little farther, and then we get into things that are really hard for you to hear. Okay, but have to be really loud for you to hear. Okay, really, really high things and really, really low things. Okay? So this is an ear. Exciting, isn't it? Okay, this is the auricle of the ear. The auricle includes the whole, basically, radar dish. Okay? There are parts of it. The helix is the curl of the cartilage. Okay? I have no idea what a lobule is for. Apparently decoration, which is fine. But as reason as any other. Okay? But the whole structure itself is to focus the sound into the hole. Okay, which is the external acoustic meatus or the external acoustic or auditory tube. Whichever one you want. I guess it's canal, auditory canal. Okay, whatever one you want to call it. Does that make sense? Okay. Did you ever notice if you go look at like dolphins and things? You guys ever looked at dolphins? Okay, do you ever look at their ears? They're just a hole with a flap, right? Well, the flap obviously is to keep water out of there. You can see what you can stick things in. Probably shouldn't stick things in, but you do anyways. Okay, to get rid of that wax, right? Okay, it has hairs, it has wax. What are the hairs for? Anybody?
To keep bugs from going in.
Yeah, it's the best suggestion I have. I'm not sure how good of a chance. The earwax definitely is for keeping bugs out. Okay? Because no one wants, I don't know, your friendly neighborhood fly to climb in your ear and lay its eggs right next to your eardrum. Because that would suck. Okay? Right? Yeah. Next time you stick a Q-tip in your ear, think about that. Okay? The ear canal is not perfectly straight. It is slightly curved. If you grab your hand and you take it like this and pull back and up, you can straighten it out. Okay? If you guys want to play with an ophthalmoscope in lab this week, I'll be more than happy to get it out and you can play with it and see each other's eardrums if you want to. Okay? It's very, very simple. Okay? Not hard at all. Okay? In the outer ear ends at the eardrum or tympanic membrane. This is a large relative to the rest of the structures. Large membrane that is very, very, very weak. Okay? It is there to flop. And it flops at exactly the rate that the hertz or frequency of the sound is. Okay, so it will vibrate at that rate. Make sense? That's transmitted to the middle ear. The middle ear, first off, is a airtight container. Okay, what's that mean? It's a bubble of air. It does have an exit, but it's not back through the eardrum. The eardrum is a solid membrane and is weak. So if this changes pressure, okay, because the outside changes pressure, what it will do is deflect the eardrum in or out, depending on which way the pressure is, if it's bigger out or bigger in. Okay? And eventually pop the eardrum. Not something you want to do because it hurts badly. Okay? So you have a relief valve, okay, called the auditory tube or eustachian tube. Okay? This goes to your nasopharynx. Okay, that's the top of your throat closest to your nasal cavity. Okay? It goes there, and when you yawn, chew gum, suckle, okay, pop your palate up, you can open that flap and allow the air, the pressure, to adjust to the outside world. That makes sense? Okay, you can do it right now. You can feel it. It probably clicks when you do it. At least mine does. Okay? Anyway, so that's really important. You also have some bones. The malleus, the incus, and the stapes. The malleus is otherwise known as the hammer. It looks like a ball-peen hammer. I realized in lab that none of you know what a ball-peen hammer is. Okay, has anybody ever done any metal work whatsoever? No. You took metal shop in middle school. I'm really sure it was so much fun. Okay, anyways, a ball-peen hammer is a round-headed hammer. Okay, you kind of see one that looks, it's got a round head on one side and a flat head on the other side. Kind of looks like a salt shaker on the end. Or maybe one of those little people, the Fisher Price on the top of the hammer. That makes sense? Well, anyways, that ball peen's used for shaping, dinging metal and giving it a nice little rounded thing. So if you see scalloped metal that looks like it has scales, okay, that's been hit with a ball peen hammer. Okay. Anyways, that's what that is, it looks like. That's why it's called the hammer. Okay, the next one's the anvil. That one has a snout on it. That's kind of sharp. Sharp. Goes down to a point. Okay, that's like the point of an anvil. Yeah, you guys have all seen an anvil. Good. Not missing that one. Good. Okay, it's got that sharpened end, which, by the way, in metallurgy is there to make curves, in case you wanted to know. Okay, and then you have the stapes, which I hope all of you can see looks like a stirrup. Because most of you know what a stirrup is, right? Okay, that is over the oval window. There's a round window down here. And we have the inner ear, which is a bony labyrinth that's filled with a membranous labyrinth, which this one's made. Okay, that is of the same shape. It has the cochlea, which is what we'll be talking about for hearing, and it has the vestibular apparati, which is what tells you what position your head is in at all times. Okay, go on.